fucking broke, man. Bank called me up, they're like, hi, we're calling because you don't have enough money. I'm like, I know. She's like, sir, you have insufficient funds. Well, that's a good way to put it, too. I agree with that. I find my funds to be grossly insufficient. Thanks for calling. Why are you mad at me? I don't understand what. How is this something I'm doing to you? She's like, sir, you only have $20. That's not enough. You can't only have $20. I'm like, look, I'm not being broke just to fuck with you. I just really don't have any money. I'm not trying to be a dick. My life is shitty. What? So they charged me. They charged me $15. That's how much it costs to only have $20. But here's the fucked up part. Now I only have $5. You ever have negative money? That's depressing, isn't it? You look in your bank account, negative $10. That's how much I have now. Negative 10. That means I don't even have no money now. I wish I did. I wish I didn't have anything. I wish I just had nothing, but I have less than that. I don't have none. I have not 10. I can't, I'm like, if it's free, I can't fucking afford it. Somebody could come up to me, take this, it's free. Fuck, that costs nothing. I can't afford that. That's more than I have. I gotta raise $10 to be broke. That's where I'm at. That's not good. That's bad. That's how different it is to be rich than it is to be poor, because when you're rich, the bank pays you for being rich. If you have a lot of money, they give you money because you have a lot of money. They say, you have so much money that we should give you some. Because you have a lot, you should have more. Here, take more money. Take this guy's 15, fuck him, you should have it. It makes perfect sense. He doesn't have enough, you have a lot.
Hello and welcome to this edition of TZM Global Radio. I'm your host for today, James Phillips from the UK chapter of the Zeitgeist movement and TZM Education. Hope you're doing well out there. The opening for today's show was a bit by Louis C.K., a really great comedian. Strongly recommend checking his stuff out. This particular piece was about the absurdity of the monetary system that we all have to live with. The idea that if you have lots of money, then generally you should have some more money because you haven't got enough. And it should generally come from the people who don't have any money, because they obviously have lots to give you. Just for the fact that you have money, you don't have to work for it. Just, you've got money. So you should have some more. It's a very funny point. Of course, if it wasn't so horrifically tragic in its actual physical effects with the global pyramid of financial structuring that we have on this planet currently, as I'm sure all of you are very well aware of. But it is our financial system that creates this structural imbalance and structural classism, if you will. Which leads me very nicely onto today's show. Today's show is going to feature a lecture from Z-Day London by a chap called Ben Dyson from a group called Positive Money. Positive Money are a monetary reform group here in the UK who question the validity of fractional reserve banking in their materials and suggest a potential alternative. They don't subscribe to our point of view, and that much is admitted at the beginning of their talk. But for now, it really doesn't matter. They are getting good traction in the media, and in terms of transition, we're not just going to jump straight out of a monetary system. So we do need a monetary system that's not so heavily slanted towards growth, that is not inherently and structurally moving wealth or money to the top of the monetary pyramid. So we do need to make some shifts in policy, and groups that aren't necessarily calling for something so far out of the norm or radical as apparently we are. It's nice to have groups like Positive Money out there who are suggesting these changes, and you can see that the mainstream media is keen to listen to what they have to say, as they've been featured in many of the mainstream newspapers over here in the UK, as well as having an interview on BBC Radio 4. And there's a good reason for that. It's because their views are more palatable for now. They're still considered reasonably extreme, I suppose, but the fact that they're getting some good publicity, I think, can only be marked as a good thing, at least in the short term. So we're going to feature that particular talk, and I'm also going to be reading from the First Civilization a little later on as well. But before then, a little bit of news, which could, by the way, well be out of date by the time this goes to air, because I do pre-record these shows. Peter Joseph was recently a featured guest on the Young Turks programme, one of the most popular alternative news programs online. I thought Peter gave a really good interview there, and raised some important questions and answered them very well. So that's well worth checking out. If you just type in Peter Joseph, Zeitgeist Movement founder, on TYT into YouTube, then you should find that interview. That's very good. Here in London, we have our first dual event. So to continue on from the theme of unity and bridging out to other organisations, we are doing paired up talks now on a monthly basis here in London, with different speakers from the day at Z-Day to begin with, and hopefully some other organisations as time goes forward. But this first evening is with David Wood from the London Futurists and Humanity Plus, so definitely worth checking them out. That event is going to be at the Elixir Bar in Camden. Although I'm actually saying that, it is actually, although it's a free event, it's actually kind of sold out, because we've got so many people saying that they're coming to this event that the venue can't hold anymore. Which is great, because we've only ever really half filled it when we were doing the events explicitly just as the Zeitgeist Movement previously. So there you go. We're all scientists around here, and we like to see some evidence. So there's your evidence. We're getting more bums on seats, and ultimately that's what we want, folks. Speaking of which, I know I've been talking about this update to TZM Education for like a gazillion years now, but basically that is coming forward, and when it does, there'll be a project to tie in with that update as well. But loosely speaking, it will involve some manner of the movement getting into schools and talking to kids, because again, if we wish to talk to the most people who are most likely to get this, then surely it would be young minds, and a captive audience. Essentially, there are ways in which you can get into a school and talk to a lot of kids all at once, and they kind of have to listen to you. So it's a great move. When you think of some of our other activities, which can be rather hit and miss, this one is always hit, and I've got the evidence to prove it. But I will talk a little bit more about that in the future. So just prior to including this presentation by Positive Money, I wanted to just allude to something that I know you're all familiar with out there from the documentary Zeitgeist Addendum. I'm sure that you're probably all familiar with the monetary section of that film, the fractional reserve banking section, in which Peter walks through the example of how fractional reserve banking works. That is pretty much a description pulled from the book Web of Debt. And if you haven't actually read that book, then you wouldn't know of an extremely interesting story that runs throughout it, which is the Wizard of Oz. I certainly didn't expect, when I turned the first few pages of that book, to start to be reading about a very popular children's tale. But nonetheless, I was, because the Wizard of Oz is not what you think it is. It's actually an allegoric reference to the banking system. and specifically the takeover of the banking elite to control the monetary system through their particular chosen method of monetary injection, which would have been gold. Now, I mean, there is some conjecture as to whether the author Frank Baum actually meant this when he wrote The Wizard of Oz, but I think through association and also his political affiliations, it seems incredibly likely that he was alluding towards a political stance with regards to The Wizard of Oz. Some very interesting points to note about that would be, what colour were Dorothy's shoes? Now, whenever you ask someone this, they always say ruby, because that was the colour of her slippers in the film, of course. But actually, in the screenplay, in the actual book, Dorothy's slippers were silver, because the currency, at least propagated by the populists in the 1890s, was that of silver. They wanted to use silver to create the currency, to have a peg, if you will, for the currency. But the bankers' system was gold. Now, when you look at those in the context of The Wizard of Oz, by the way, Oz stands for ounces, then you look at Dorothy's situation in Kansas, and she lives in a bit of a Dust Bowl farm and what have you, but you know, it's kind of real, it's reality. And she's swept up in this tornado and taken off to this magical land where all she has to do is follow the yellow brick road, the golden brick road. Along that road, she will meet the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Lion. Now, the Scarecrow has been alluded to a couple of things. You could take your pick between these, or it could be both. They could be the farmers who were seen as rather brainless, but nonetheless a very important part of the political movements in the 1890s, and then the Tin Man, which could represent industry, who both needed courage of the Lion to challenge the Wizard of Oz when they got to Oz. The other part of that might be that the Scarecrow is the straw man, which relates to your birth certificate, because your birth certificate is a straw man document. It's not you, it's the representation of you, and of course under contract law you have to be of sound mind when a contract is signed for you, and you can't have it signed on your behalf, and a birth certificate is both of these things. It's your straw man. So it was kind of alluding to that, and the fact that if we only had a few brains to work that out, then we might be able to challenge the establishment. But anyway, the initial allegory of them being the farmers and industry needing the courage of a lion to go and question the wizard seems to be the more plausible of the two. So they go to Oz and they challenge this wizard, who has a big booming voice and sounds very convincing. And when you pull back the curtain, what is it? It's just a little man sitting there pulling some strings, who admits that he's not that great a wizard after all. And of course he represents the global banking elite. For, as Amschel Rothschild once famously quoted, "Give me control of a nation's money supply and I care not who makes its laws." And that's what we have to do. We have to wear our silver slippers and go to Oz and question him, and then we click our silver slippers and say there's no place like home, and we get back to reality of Kansas and the reality of where we can actually make all of our dreams come true somewhere over the rainbow. That is a lovely story, you know. It's a lovely story. Of course, we're not living in the 1890s, and whilst I firmly stand behind groups like Positive Money, and I would even say the populists had a very good point with their argument. We are where we are, and we do need to challenge these things, but we also have to have a notion of what we're going to replace it with, because if we're going to replace it with much of the same thing as usual, then we're going to get much of the same thing. Now, there's some really, really good information out there about fractional reserve banking, and that's all well and good. But if you're talking to your friends about money and how it's created, or your family, then The Wizard of Oz is a really good entry point. You know, everybody loves that story. Everybody finds it interesting, and even used as an interesting point of trivia. Even if that's all it was, then it's a very good entry into the conversation that leads people down a further road of going, well, is that really how money's created? And you're doing it through the allure of aesthetics, the allure of a story, and a very popular story at that. So I often find that works very, very well with a lot of people when you say, you know, do you know what The Wizard of Oz is actually really about? You're getting their interest first, and I very, very rarely get anything. In fact, every single response I've ever got is, no, what is it about? And then when you start running through it, they go, really? God, that's clever. And then you say, yep, and that's your system, in fact, and it's been in place since 1913. And then you can go on to Jekyll Island and all of that kind of stuff. But by then, hopefully the seed of interest has been planted, so to speak. You're certainly not going to win any friends by walking up to them and saying, hey, do you want to hear about banking? At least most people would be like, no thanks. I'd rather go back to watching The X Factor. So you've got to meet people somewhere on their level, haven't you? In fact, interesting activism idea just popped into my head. You could stick a sandwich board up on the pavement with some ruby slippers in front of it, maybe saying something like, free ruby slippers to anybody who can guess the true meaning behind the story of The Wizard of Oz. That should hopefully reel a few people in, and then you have a few Zeitgeist movement flyers in your pocket, and after a little bit of a conversation, they could perhaps go away with a fresh perspective on not just money, but on their social system. So yeah, I'll throw that idea out there. It's a little bit of an interesting concept, but ultimately things like that could potentially be a more interesting way of drawing people into a conversation. So yeah, I'll throw that out there and see if it sticks. But anyway, let's move on and include this lecture now from London Z-Day 2013. This is Ben Dyson from Positive Money.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the money aspect of this whole problem. And my organization is proposing certain reforms to the monetary system that aren't quite as radical as the Zeitgeist movement. So it's a piece of the puzzle. It might not be the full way that we eventually want to change things, and there's a further discussion to have about that. But let's start at the beginning. Where does money actually come from? Now, if you ask this question to most people in the street, the answer seems really obvious. If you take out any 10 or 20 pound note, you're going to see the words, the Bank of England, printed on the side. But there's a twist in the tale here, because the Bank of England only actually creates a small percentage of all the money in the economy. It's actually just 3%. That 3% is the cash that you use in the economy. So where does the other 97% come from? Well, the answer is that other 97% of all the money in the economy comes from banks. It's actually created by banks. So when you walk into a bank to take out a mortgage to buy a house, that money isn't coming from somebody else's savings. It's actually new money that is being effectively created out of nothing at the point when you took out the loan. Now, usually when I tell people this, they think I'm mad, and they find it impossible to believe. So just show you a couple of quotes from people with far more credibility than me. This is the governor at the Bank of England, the most senior person at the Bank of England. He says, when banks extend loans to their customers, they create money by crediting their customers' accounts. So this is a process. When you take out a loan, those numbers that appear in your account, they're not coming from somewhere. They're actually just new numbers that are typed into the account. And this works through the accounting process that banks use. There's nothing illegal or fraudulent about it. It's just the way that the system works. Martin Wolf, the main economics commentator for the Financial Times, saying that the essence of the contemporary monetary system is the creation of money out of nothing by private banks, often foolish lending. Some people question the use of the word often in that quote. So So the result, when you give banks the power to create money, and you give them all the bonuses and commissions and incentives to lend as much as they can, what happens is they create too much money, and this is the result that you have. This green line down at the bottom is the amount of cash that the Bank of England and the state has created. This blue line is the amount of money created by the banks. And this is over the last 40-odd years. So you can see this has got completely out of control. The cash is just 3% of all the money that exists. The other 97% is created by the banking system. Now the thing is that the law that says you're not allowed to create your own money only applies to this 3%. And it's never been updated to apply to the electronic money that you see in your bank account. So now 97% of the money is not covered by the existing laws that prevent you from printing your own money at home. Okay. Right, so what are the consequences of a system where we allow the banks to create all of the money that we're using? Well, as you've seen, they're going to create too much. Because if the more you lend, the more bonuses and commissions you get the prospect of being promoted within the bank you're working for. You're going to lend as much as possible, but every loan you're making is creating new money in the process. And banks tend to use this to create this money for the wrong things. And when I say the wrong things, 40% of all the money they created went straight into the property market. 37% of the money they created in the 10 years before the financial crisis went into financial markets. So that's things like speculation, things like trading on financial markets, commodity trading, speculation. Just 13% went into the business part of the economy. So this fairy tale that a lot of people have, that what banks do is they take money from savers and then go and invest it in businesses, and that helps these businesses grow and create jobs and helps the economy grow. It's a fairy tale. It's the tiniest part of what banks actually do. And then the remaining 10% went into things like personal loans and credit cards. Now, we've been arguing for 2.5 years that if you put so much money into things, well, we've been arguing that basically the financial crisis was not really so much about things like CDOs and all these financial products. It was more about the ability that banks had to create money essentially out of nothing and put that money into these parts of the economy. And then about 4 weeks ago, the chairman of the Financial Services Authority, so the main regulator in the UK, came out and said this: the financial crisis of 2007-2008 occurred because we failed to constrain the private financial system's creation of private credit and money. So this idea that allowing banks to create money might be a problem, which 2 or 3 years ago was quite radical, is now becoming so much part of the mainstream that the chairman of the FSA is saying the same things. But it also leads to debt, because this red line you see here is the total amount of debt that we have as the public to the banking sector. And you might ask the question, why is it going up almost at the same rate as the amount of money? It's because banks create money when they make loans. So for every pound of new money that comes into the economy, there's also a pound of new debt. And you can see this in the run-up to the financial crisis. If you see at the end where that red line is coming down, and you think that's a good thing because it means people are reducing the debts, a large amount of that fall in the debt is people going bankrupt, losing their homes, being unable to pay their debts. So there's a real sort of human crisis in this chart here. And then it fuels inequality, because we have to borrow the money supply of the economy. We have to pay interest on all of this money that we've borrowed, and that amounts to between 108 billion and 217 billion pounds every year that's been transferred from the public across to the banking system. Now, some of this money comes back to people through, the interest you get on your savings, through things like corporation tax on the banks, but a large amount of it is being creamed off in the middle. And this is why you have this sort of increasing inequality, with some people getting richer and richer all the time, whereas everybody else is getting further into debt and actually becoming poorer. Also makes houses completely unaffordable. So you've probably heard this argument that the reason why houses are so expensive are because there are too many people in this country and there's not enough houses. We've not been building enough and we've been having too much immigration. Well, that's kind of the argument that you might hear from politicians and from the newspapers. The evidence for it doesn't back that up at all. So this chart here, this purple line is house prices over the last 20 odd years. The green line at the bottom is the population, and this is how much it's grown. In that period of time, it's grown by about 8%. The red line, which you can probably barely even see the difference from the back of the room, slightly higher than the green line, that's the number of houses, the amount of housing in the country, and that's grown at 16% over that time. So actually, the amount of housing has grown faster than the population. So any guesses what the blue line at the top is? It's mortgage lending. So this mortgage lending, remember that every loan that a bank makes creates new money. This is hundreds of billions of pounds of new money being created and put into property. And that is why house prices have become so expensive now. It's nothing to do with there not being enough houses. There's about 1 million empty houses in this country. It's because we allowed banks to create all this money and put it into the property market. And another aspect of the inequality is that it leads to this very sort of unbalanced economy where most politicians and most of the media believe that our entire economy is dependent on the banking sector. Part of the reason for that is that when we have to borrow all the money that we need to run the economy from the banks, then we have to pay interest on all of this back to the banks. So again, you have this redistribution back to the financial sector and the financial centres, and that tends to be London. And then you have environmental impacts from this as well. So the first thing is that we have no control over what banks invest in, so naturally they go for the short-term things like oil and arms, rather than the things that will actually have the greatest long-term benefit. There's the fact that this system leads to financial crises and recessions, and when that happens, the government then says, well, all of the environmental protections and the regulations that we've developed over the last 10 or 20 years, we can't afford them anymore because we're in a recession. We need to get the economy going again. So we're going to wipe out all this environmental protection, which they will call red tape, and try and get back to the short-termism that we've really suffered from. And then you also have the fact that when you have so much debt in the economy, everybody is, in one way or another, trying to either work to pay off that debt, or businesses are trying to grow and produce more cheaply in order to be able to service the debt. So it creates this strange dynamic in the economy, this sort of false scarcity, and this need for everybody to be growing and to be working to keep paying the interest on all the debt. And then when the whole system does cause a crisis like the one we're having right now, it's very difficult to get out of it because when money is created by the banking sector, as I showed you with the chart before, if we want to get more money into the economy, we have to go further into debt because the only source of money is to borrow it from banks. It's the banks that create it. But then if a crisis that was caused by too much debt and we say, well, we want to reduce the debt, well, that's going to lead to you having less money in the economy because the opposite thing happens. When you take out a loan, new money is created. When you pay that loan back, the money disappears from the economy. And the first time I heard that, I found it very difficult to believe. If you go to the Positive Money website, you can find the accounting and the process that this actually happens by. What we need right now is less debt in the economy, but also some more money. And we need some money in the hands of people so that they can pay off the debt that has been built up over the last 20-odd years. But that's impossible in the current system. So, what do we do? I'm just going to quickly show you what Positive Money is advocating. As I said, it's not. What this is something that we think could be implemented in the next 10 years. It's not necessarily the perfect solution, and there's a further discussion to have about how you reform the monetary system. But the first thing we think you absolutely have to do is remove the power that banks have to create money. because, as you saw, they create too much of it and they use it for the wrong things. You can do this through some fairly simple changes to the way that banks operate. What it means for you is that when you walk into a bank, you have two options. You either say to the bank, I want you to keep my money safe for me, or you say, I want you to take this money and go and invest it somewhere in the economy. And you have a really clear choice between whether your money is being kept safe or whether it's being put at risk and invested. And what that does is it removes the ability that banks have to create money, turns them back into the middlemen that most people think they are. So they're actually taking money from savers and then lending it to borrowers. Okay. So then you need to give that power back to some kind of transparent and accountable body. And really, we've seen from history that we can't trust banks with this power to create money. But we personally believe you can't really trust politicians either. They have the same conflicts of interest and the same incentives to abuse this power to create money for their own sort of short-term gain. They're only thinking about 5 years at a time, So we wouldn't give this power to create money back to politicians. What we think you need to do is you have to separate two decisions. And it's a decision over how much money you create and what that money is used for. And we think that when it comes to the decision over how much money you create, it's not really a political decision. It's not about whether we want to create enough money to build speed rail or the Millennium Dome or Crossrail or anything like this. It's about what is actually needed in the economy from the perspective of how the economy is functioning. If you put too much money in, you're going to cause inflation, and actually that doesn't lead to any greater wealth in the economy. It just distorts the actual prices that we have. So we suggest that you have an independent body which is accountable to Parliament, but it's not a political organisation. So these people are not trying to get re-elected. They're not thinking about pandering to the voters and the press. They're thinking about the long-term interests of the economy. And the decision over how this money is actually spent should be the government through the usual process by which they decide how to spend all the tax revenue. Then you need to make sure that money is only created when inflation is low and steady. So what we've had with the banks is that when they see inflation going up, they think, well, that means the economy is doing well, it's healthy, the economy is growing, so they start creating more money. If they see house prices rising, they think that's a time to start lending more. So when they see prices going up, they create more money, and that causes more inflation. They then create even more money, and you get a chart like this, blue one at the top here. What we would suggest is that if you have an independent body whose job is to stop creating money when inflation starts going up, you get something more like the line at the bottom. What that means is houses don't become so unaffordable, the economy stays more stable, and if you have savings, they don't get reduced by the fact that all prices are going up. Okay, and then fourth thing is that you need to create money free of debt. So as I said just a minute ago, in the current system, if we want to get more money in the economy, then people have to borrow more from banks because it is banks that create money when they make loans. And actually what we need is less debt and more money in the economy. The only way you can do this, and it's a way that the government and the Bank of England aren't doing at all at the moment, is to create money without the debt attached and then actually spend that into the economy. Then that money gets to the real economy, it gets to ordinary people instead of the financial markets, and that can be used to pay off some of the existing debt. So instead of, what the government is trying to do at the moment is get banks lending again, so that they're creating more money, putting that money into the economy. What would happen then is that the debt would fall. So this chart here is what the policy at the moment is trying to do, what the government would like to see happen. What happens if you start creating money debt-free is that you can put new money into the economy, but that can then pay off the old debt. And if you want to look into this in more detail, again, this is all explained on our website. Then instead of having this, okay, this is the figures that I did for Iceland last week, so ignore that. But instead of paying all this interest across to the banking sector, that would be significantly less. It could be half as much, maybe even less than that. Okay, we've got to then put this money into the real economy. So the way you can do this, you can do it through government budgets. You add it to the tax revenue that they get from people. Let's do a show of hands. Here are the options. You can spend more on public services, you can cut taxes, pay down the national debt, or you could actually just give money directly to people. Who would go for the first option? Interesting. Cut taxes? Yeah, a few. Paying down the national debt? Yeah. Just giving it directly to people? Yeah. Easy choice. Okay, and then quickly, final thing, you need to give people control and transparency over how their money is invested. So if you're putting money into a bank, you need to be told where this money is going to go. And if they say, oh, we might use some of this for the arms industry, you need that option to say, well, forget it, I'm going to go somewhere else. At the moment, they're not required to disclose that kind of information. So just to quickly recap, remove the power of banks to create money, return that to some democratic, transparent and accountable process, not necessarily politicians because they might abuse it. Create money free of debt, create money when inflation is low and stable, and then get that money the real economy instead of putting it into the financial markets, and then give us some control over how that money is used. Any questions?
And I'm sure many of you would have many of your own questions, and there were some very good questions from the floor. But if you want to see those questions, then just type in Ben Dyson, Positive Money, Z-Day London 2013, or something along those lines, and it'll come up on YouTube, and you can watch some of Ben's answers to those questions. As I stated prior to including this lecture, and Ben stated prior to his, we don't necessarily agree on everything, but Ben has said to me, at least in person, that long-term, the Zeitgeist movement is obviously the direction we want to go in. We want a correlation between our economic practices and the planet that we live on. That's common sense. I think Ben just feels that money is a tool and an instrument for exchange, and if it goes back to being based on that, rather than all of the fantasy land stuff that it's based on now, then that's a good thing. And maybe Ben would argue for resting there. I don't know. I haven't discussed it in that much detail with him. But ultimately, we feel as the Zeitgeist movement that you do need to go further than that. That money is the corruption. It's a scarcity reinforcing mechanism. It's a divisive mechanism. It has no real tangible scientific attachment to the intelligent management of our resources, and it will eventually need to go if we're going to have a sustainable, steady state economy based on true efficiency and the intelligent management of the Earth's resources. Ultimately, it's going to have to go one way or the other. But of course, it will have to go technically. It will have to be done away with in a very real and practical way, i.e. the very nature of why we use a monetary system will have to be overcome technically, as we're all very well aware, at least on this, at least the people listening to this radio show will be very aware of. Okay, and this leads us to the last portion of today's show. I'm going to be continuing to read from the book The First Civilization by Jas Garcher, which you can find online by typing that into Google, and that should lead you through to the PDF, which is also available through the Zeitgeist Movement's website as well, if you wish to read along. So we're going to be picking up from page 39 in the questions section of the book. Question: what about people who don't want to join with this new society? This question is actually much easier to address than it sounds, because similar situations exist today. At present, we have groups such as the Amish and the Hutterites who eschew mainstream society in favour of their own way of life. These groups generally form their own small communities outside of cities and are able to maintain their way of life with relatively little interference from the outside world. A similar logic would be used for any groups that do not wish to join into an RBE. They would simply form their own small communities away from mainstream society and be able to go on living whatever lifestyle they wished. There would be no reason that anyone within these groups would have to be forced into joining mainstream society. In fact, in an RBE, there would be the advantage of not having the land owned by anyone, meaning these groups would not have to isolate themselves onto small plots of land which might restrict their lifestyles. This is most commonly seen today with the indigenous First Nation group here in North America. These groups are isolated into tiny reservations, resulting in a detrimental health situation in which diabetes and depression are drastically higher than those in communities not facing restrictive isolation. In an RBE, groups such as these would simply be allowed to return to their traditional lifestyle, free to once again live in harmony with the land without restrictions or borders, just as their ancestors did before colonialism began. In addition, they would still have access to all of the conveniences of RBE technology, such as advanced medicine, whenever it was required. Much like individuals on reservations make use of modern technology to assist their lifestyles today, it would therefore be advisable for any such groups to maintain a VAC train station near their settlement so they could have easy access to the RBE cities whenever it was required. This would also result in the mutual advantage of both societies being able to easily share information and learn from each other. Communities living in close proximity with nature would have access to valuable information about the environment that those of us in the cities might not be able to notice as easily. The idea that capitalist settlements and colonies might continue to dot the landscape is certainly not impossible. But I imagine it would be difficult for any such groups to maintain a sizable population. After all, why would anyone choose to live in a society that forces them to toil and labour in order to scrape together enough money to buy the things they need, when they could switch to a society in which everyone simply has access to everything they need for free? In my opinion, the only way such settlements could last for an appreciable amount of time would be to practice extreme isolation and prevent their inhabitants, as much as possible, from knowing that the RBE civilization is out there. A task of immense difficulty, to say the least. Therefore, I predict that there would be little contact between capitalist settlements, who will likely be isolationists, and mainstream society, and that the vast majority of capitalist settlements would dissolve within a few generations due to population loss. I must stress that this prediction is entirely speculative, but it does seem to be the most likely outcome of any interaction between capitalist settlements and an RBE. To summarise, any group not wishing to join with mainstream society in an RBE would simply be allowed to form their own communities. If you do not wish to be part of the RBE, there is no reason you have to be. But be forewarned, the potential of living in a civilization such as an RBE will likely prove to be very persuasive. Statement. This sounds a lot like socialism. Equality is bad. You socialists want to take away all of my stuff. This is perhaps the most frustrating question that every supporter of an RBE must repeatedly answer. Isn't this just socialism? Unfortunately, most of us have had to suffer through an education system that teaches us that there are only two possible ways a society can be run. Anything that is not capitalism is socialism, and anything that is not socialism is capitalism. Even though there should be an infinite number of ways to run a society, our collective mind seems to be stuck on just two. I could spend a few paragraphs expounding all of the differences between socialism and an RBE. For example, socialist systems include such winning qualities as scarcity, forced labour, poverty, laws, an environment that encourages violence, and an elite ruling class with resulting social stratification, none of which would exist in an RBE. But instead I'll simply give in and play the labelling game. Technically, an RBE, as I've described it, others may interpret the RBE concept differently, could be considered an anarcho-technocracy. Sounds scary, doesn't it? Well, a technocracy is a system in which decision-making power rests primarily in the hands of scientists, engineers, technicians, and other such individuals who are likely to possess the most relevant practical knowledge required to run society. At first glance, this might sound a lot like a dictatorship. However, this is where the important prefix anarcho comes into play. Since an RBE is an anarchist society, there are no specific groups who possess more power than anyone else. Instead, every single individual in the population is a potential technocrat who can gain the knowledge necessary to contribute to society in whatever way best suits their talents and interests. This kind of system can be understood further by comparing it to open source projects such as the Linux operating systems. Anyone is free to study and improve upon its design, but only those who can understand and work with the source code will be able to do so. This is essentially how an RBE functions. Only instead of a single project requiring expertise in that field, there would be an indefinite number of projects involving problems in a huge number of fields. So whilst this system might superficially resemble socialism with its emphasis on equality, it avoids the pitfall of placing dictatorial power in the hands of a small group. In fact, the very presence of a ruling class of any kind means that the society in question cannot be considered to be truly equal, since there is a group that has access to far more power and influence than the rest of the population. This means that the archetypal examples of socialism that people are most likely to point out as evidence against equality, such as China, Cuba, and the former Soviet Union, are not even valid examples of equality. It never really existed in these countries. This leads us directly to the assertion that equality is bad. A truly egalitarian society has never actually been created on a large scale. Therefore, the immediate judgment of equality as being a bad thing is illogical. There is no real evidence to base that claim on. I should also remind you of our discussion in the previous section about the numerous benefits equality brings to both the individual and for society as a whole. Better health, less crime, less addictions, more trust, etc. If anything, equality is one of the most beneficial attributes a society could possibly possess. However, we must also take into account the way that equality is employed. In the aforementioned socialist countries, equality is forced onto the majority of society by bringing almost everyone down. That is, most of the population have their standard of living drastically reduced, so that almost everyone lives equally dismal lives. The key word here is almost. Let's not forget about the ruling class that ultimately controls the lives of the remaining population, and generally enjoys a much higher standard of living. However, in an RBE, equality is produced by actually elevating everyone to the highest standard of living possible. This is an absolutely crucial difference that needs to be recognised. Rather than creating equality by having the population live equally lousy lives, equality is created by ensuring that everyone's life is as healthy and fulfilling as it could possibly be. One could argue that, in a way, this equality is still being forced upon people. However, since an RBE would be a completely voluntary society to join, as we talked about in the previous query, this is technically untrue. Furthermore, you might think that the very idea of this kind of equality is impossible. How can everyone be equal while simultaneously having their standard of life increased? Basically, it comes down to the level of technology. A middle-class person living in a developed nation today actually has a higher standard of living than the wealthiest kings from a few hundred years ago. Think about it for a moment. Kings may have had lots of gold and jewels, but we have advanced medical technology and automobiles. A king may have been given his own special seat at the opera, but we can cram thousands of opera performances into a small device that fits in our pocket. A king may have had servants to deliver messages for him, but we have cell phones that can allow for real-time conversation with people on the other side of the planet whenever we feel like it. Technology has given us access to much greater health and convenience than the wealthiest of the past could ever have dreamed of. Likewise, by taking full advantage of advanced technology in an RBE, every single individual would enjoy a standard of living that is far above what is possible today. We would enjoy better physical and mental health, superior education, more positive social relations, the abolition of forced labour, and all of the conveniences of a technologically advanced society. So to summarise, what is the difference between socialism and an RBE? An RBE is a system without scarcity, forced labour, poverty, laws and social stratification. It's a system that encourages a much higher standard of living for the whole of the population than what we see in contemporary socialist nations. And it is a system of true equality rather than the relative lie that has been passed for equality in countries of the past and present. Another way to make the comparison between socialism and an RBE is that the former involves the redistribution of wealth, taking wealth from those who possess the most and passing it round amongst the rest of the population, whereas the latter is simply the distribution of wealth, giving everyone what they need without taking from anyone, since wealth is ultimately produced by an automated system rather than a particular group. Lastly, there is the argument that, in order for a global RBE to actually come into being, there would be a need for someone to come into your home and take your stuff. Once again, I would remind you of the fact that an RBE would be a completely voluntary society. If you did not want to join, no one would walk into your home and begin taking your stuff. You and your stuff would be left to form whatever kind of community you desired with others who do not wish to join. You might argue that there would still be a need to take all of the land and infrastructure that is currently owned by the capitalist powers that be. As for the infrastructure, an RBE would require entirely new infrastructure to begin with. There would be little or no usefulness in taking over existing infrastructure, which is simply not advanced enough to accommodate an RBE's technology. As for the land itself, as you'll see in the next section, the transition to an RBE will likely end up having little or no requirement for land of any kind in order to get started, and may end up having very little requirement for land overall. Most importantly, we have to keep in mind that an RBE would be a society of advanced technology, where every item built is designed to be as high quality as technically possible. Why would such a society have any need for your primitive gas guzzler car, or your archaic home made of bricks and wood? The goods currently being used in contemporary society are so much lower in efficiency and usefulness that there would simply be no reason for anyone within an RBE to want them. There would be nothing useful to gain from taking anything from anyone in a capitalist world. So rest assured, if you did not wish to join an RBE, nothing of yours would be forcibly taken. There would be simply no reason for it. Statement. We shouldn't be so quick to abandon capitalism. After all, capitalism is what got us to this point. Instead of abandoning it, we should try to improve upon it through economic and political reform. Anything else is too idealistic to work anyways. Part of this assertion is certainly true. We have reached our current level of technological advancement through the use of the capitalist system. However, this does not necessarily mean that this is the best system to carry us into the future. Our current system has, in fact, brought us to a point where it has rendered itself obsolete. In the same way that computers of today are used to create faster and more powerful computers of tomorrow, the economic system of today has given us the ability to create a superior system for the future. Therefore, just as people abandoned the horse-drawn carriage in favour of the automobile, so too does it make logical sense for us to abandon capitalism in favour of an RBE. Some might then argue that rather than abandon our current system, we should work within it to bring about improvements whenever and wherever possible. After all, nothing is perfect, right? Unfortunately, there is no amount of political or economic reform that will allow us to solve the majority of problems caused by our current system, because this system is built upon a fundamentally flawed foundation. A foundation that cannot be corrected without a complete overhaul of our entire society. This foundation I speak of is inequality. A system in which all people are forced into competition with each other is one that will invariably lead to social stratification. Some people will be very rich and have much more than they need. Some will just barely be able to acquire the resources they need for survival, and some will be unable to survive at all. We saw in the previous section that inequality is responsible for the prominence of virtually every social problem that one can think of, whereas equality leads to the near universal improvement of these social problems. Therefore, it is in the best interest of any society that is actually concerned about the well-being of its inhabitants to maximize equality as much as possible. One could even say that the single most foolish and irresponsible thing a society could possibly do is to encourage inequality. Unfortunately, inequality is a foundational aspect of our current system. This, then, is my fundamental criticism of capitalism. We cannot hope to solve the myriad of social problems plaguing our world unless we can rid ourselves of inequality. And therefore, it is only logical that we rid ourselves of the system that perpetuates this inequality. Creating an economic system structured around inequality is the logical equivalent of building a house out of wood and termites. The very structure of the house constantly eats away at itself, thus leaving the building in a state of perpetual instability and crisis. Perpetual instability and crisis seems to provide an accurate description of the state of human affairs for some time now. An important point to mention is that this opposition to capitalism has nothing to do with being outright anti-competition or pro-equality. It is simply a matter of taking the most logical course of action possible, and replacing that which does not work with something that actually might. Capitalism runs on and encourages inequality, and inequality fuels virtually every social problem in existence, and so the original source of inequality must be removed. In fact, my entire argument against capitalism can be overcome if either of the following points can be shown to be true. 1. Capitalism is capable of creating, maintaining and advancing a society without inequality or social stratification of any kind. 2. Inequality is socially superior to equality. That is, inequality solves social problems and leads to a more humane and functioning world than does equality. Fixing some of the problems with capitalism would not necessarily result in the creation of a better system than an RBE. After all, an RBE offers freedom from forced labour and laws, the abolition of debt and servitude, and the maximisation of technological convenience. Even if we could somehow force capitalism to work, is it worth doing so in the face of a system like an RBE? I think you can figure out my answer to this question, but I'll leave you to come up with an answer of your own. Lastly, for the notion that systems like the RBE are too idealistic to work, I will address this with another question. Which is more idealistic? A society in which every aspect is set up to maximize the possibility of stability and advancement while minimizing the probability of violence and other destructive behaviors? Or a society in which we are all pitted against each other in an all-out brawl for supremacy that is somehow supposed to be beneficial for all contestants? Once again, I'll leave you to answer this question yourself. Statement. Without a competitive monetary system, there would no longer be any individual excellence or self-improvement. The need to make money forces people to improve themselves. One might argue that a system based on equality without the forceful motivation of money would be one in which there would no longer be any individual excellence or self-improvement. After all, doesn't our competitive monetary system force us to improve ourselves and become better people? I would have to argue that the truth is, in fact, the exact opposite. Without a monetary system that forces people to waste time and energy on fruitless tasks, many of which provide nothing of objective value to themselves and society, everyone would actually have the freedom, both of time and resources, necessary to improve themselves and enrich their lives. Consider once again how often people pursue hobbies that actually carry immense costs in terms of money and time, but are often far more fulfilling and central to a person's life than their occupation. In a real way, what we call self-improvement in today's system is often an illusion. Improving one's ability to accumulate money and things may or may not result in objective self-improvement. That is, improvement in one's physical and mental health, or in skills which are of practical, artistic, or spiritual benefit to the self and to society. In this regard, the monetary system is the ultimate enemy of true self-improvement and stagnates the improvement of society as a whole. And we're going to stop reading there on page 44, just before the question, why do you want to get rid of my country? Is sovereignty not important? Always one of my favourite questions to answer. But we'll leave that for the next radio show. One thing I would say about one point made in there about the wholesale destruction of capitalism or overturning of it, made there, and a very excellent point about inequality. I couldn't agree more. You can't expect to have a healthy social system that is literally based on creating inequality and expect it somehow to create equality. That's obviously foolhardy. But nonetheless, this is what we have, and there are moves we can make within this structure to render it obsolete, as Buckminster Fuller once very well and eloquently put. You don't change a system by merely complaining about it, you must render it technically obsolete. So ideas such as CFS by Doug Millett, cybernated farm systems, and things like that are essentially undercutting the system we currently live in are good moves, and I think that they should be promoted as something that's positive. Moving away from the particular nastiest banks, at least, towards banks that explicitly do not support war, or things such and alike as this, can't be quantified as negative moves. We do have to live in this world. We do have to live with a monetary system, and we will probably, or there's a very great likelihood at least, that we will die in one. But as Doug Millett recently said in the Q&A in LA, if you're doing it for the reason of your own selfishness and the fact, or you're doing it for your own reasons that you want to live in that society rather than just fighting for it because it's what makes sense, then you might have your aim in the wrong place, so to speak. Don't get me wrong. I would love to live in this world. I very much would. I'd love my children to live in this world where they don't have to turn on the news and see the horror show of war and stupidity that our species is currently engaged in, when there is a clear path that it has been shown to us by our best method of decision making we have ever come to stumble across, that be the scientific method. But nonetheless, it is what we currently have, and we do have to operate and function inside this system. And to not appreciate that is to not appreciate reality, the very thing that we would like to be a little bit more connected with. So, that being said, it is some capacity of the human being to be able to look forward into the future and to be able to dream, if you will. Because surely, synonymous with a subject discussed earlier in this radio broadcast, surely, sometimes it's nice to just dream about that place somewhere over the rainbow. Thanks very much for listening, guys.